Somewhere beneath the turquoise water of the Caribbean Sea, something is moving that should not be moving this fast. Scientists who have spent their entire careers studying the slow, patient rhythm of the Earth's crust are now looking at data that breaks that rhythm entirely. A stretch of ocean floor that tourists fly over every single day, completely unaware, is quietly rewriting the rules of how continents are born and how oceans die. This is not a story about a distant fault line nobody visits. This is happening under one of the most popular travel destinations on Earth, and the people who understand it best are telling us they are genuinely worried about what comes next. To understand why, you have to understand what the Caribbean actually is, geologically speaking. The entire region sits on top of the Caribbean Plate, a relatively small oceanic slab of crust boxed in by much larger neighbors. To the north, it grinds against the North American Plate. To the south, it collides with the South American Plate. To the west, it interacts with the Cocos and Nazca Plates near Central America. This small plate has been losing that fight for tens of millions of years, producing one of the most geologically violent regions on the planet. The eastern edge of the plate is where the real drama unfolds. There, along a curved chain of islands known as the Lesser Antilles, the oceanic crust of the Atlantic is being forced downward beneath the Caribbean Plate in a process called subduction. This is the same basic mechanism that built the volcanoes of the Pacific Ring of Fire, and it is happening in the Atlantic, a place most people never associate with tectonic danger. Subduction zones produce the planet's most powerful earthquakes and most explosive volcanoes, and researchers now believe the plate motion driving this one is more active and more complex than earlier models suggested. If you are enjoying this deep dive into what is happening beneath our feet, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. New geodynamic modeling traces the origins of this subduction zone back nearly 140 million years to a period when an ancient plate began pushing beneath the South American margin, shoving the old Caribbean plateau into a trench and triggering the birth of the Lesser Antilles arc. For decades, scientists assumed this was simply ancient history. The newest simulations show it triggered a massive reorganization of mantle flow that is still influencing the region's geology today. A plume of hot material rising from deep within the mantle does not disappear once it forms, and some researchers now believe this leftover plume activity helps explain why the Caribbean remains so seismically restless even after tens of millions of years. While that ancient history explains the deep structure, it is the present-day motion drawing the most attention right now. Along the southern boundary of the plate, near Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, researchers have identified a fault system that is, in their own words, primed to produce a major earthquake. This comes from GPS tracking and satellite radar data gathered over years, allowing scientists to measure exactly how much strain is building and how much is being released. The Caribbean Plate is creeping eastward relative to South America at roughly 20 millimeters a year. Across geological time, that adds up to enormous accumulated stress. A significant portion of this boundary is locked, meaning the two plates are stuck together instead of sliding past each other smoothly, storing tension like a stretched rubber band waiting to snap. One fault running through this island of Trinidad was found to be absorbing roughly 70% of the plate's relative motion, creeping across the entire island. Combined with the locked sections nearby, the boundary as a whole is now considered capable of producing an earthquake as powerful as magnitude 8, large enough to devastate coastal regions and potentially trigger dangerous tsunamis. Populated cities sit almost directly on top of this boundary. Northern Venezuela has dense coastal populations living within reach of a fault system scientists now describe as primed and ready. Predicting the exact timing of a major earthquake remains essentially impossible, but the stress is real, measurable, and has been quietly accumulating without a major release for a long time. The story does not stop at earthquakes. There's a strange, still not fully understood pattern connecting Caribbean seismic activity to the rotation of the entire planet. Researchers studying decades of earthquake and eruption data noticed that the majority of major events around the Caribbean Plate cluster during periods when Earth's rotation rate is slowing down with a consistent delay of roughly 4 to 6 years after each slowdown. Nobody has a fully satisfying explanation for why, since the forces involved seem far too small to trigger something as violent as a major earthquake, yet the pattern keeps showing up decade after decade in the historical record. What makes this relevant right now is the forecast attached to the research. Based on the historical pattern and lag time, scientists have identified a decade of heightened Caribbean tectonic hazard beginning around 2030, driven by a probable slowing in Earth's spin rate already underway. Layer that forecast on top of the locked, stress-loaded fault near Venezuela and Trinidad, and multiple independent lines of evidence from completely different branches of Earth science start pointing toward the same general window of time. Meanwhile, the Lesser Antilles subduction zone continues its slow descent into the mantle, one of only two fully developed subduction zones in the entire Atlantic Ocean, the other being the Scotia Arc near Antarctica. That rarity is exactly why scientists study it so closely. The Atlantic is still largely a young, growing ocean, and for an ocean like that to eventually stop growing and begin shrinking, new subduction zones have to form along its margins. This long cycle is called the Wilson cycle, describing the entire life story of an ocean from violent birth to eventual closure. The Atlantic was born roughly 180 million years ago when the supercontinent Pangaea broke apart, and the Lesser Antilles subduction zone is one of the mechanisms pointing toward its eventual decline, even if that decline takes an almost unimaginable amount of time. Researchers studying a completely different subduction zone beneath the Strait of Gibraltar believe they may be watching the early stages of this exact same process happening in real time, with models suggesting it is still active and slowly migrating westward, potentially forming a third major Atlantic subduction system. Alongside the Lesser Antilles and Scotia Arcs, that comparison matters because it reframes what is happening in the Caribbean today. The Lesser Antilles subduction zone is not some ancient settled feature frozen in the record. It is an active, ongoing process, one piece of a much larger, planet-scale mechanism reshaping the Atlantic Ocean. And the same forces responsible for building it are still very much in motion beneath the islands people visit for vacation every year. There is also a biological layer many people never consider. Recent research examining the northeastern Caribbean found that tectonic activity along the Lesser Antilles arc physically reshaped the pathways available to living organisms for millions of years, with significant uplift, subsidence, and large-scale rotation of entire crustal blocks, creating temporary land corridors that allowed species to disperse between South America and the Greater Antilles. The same tectonic instability that threatens dangerous earthquakes today is also part of the reason certain plant and animal species exist where they do now. If this kind of deep science content is something you want more of, make sure you subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming. So where does this leave us right now, with all of this evidence sitting on the table at the same time? On one side, an ancient subduction zone whose roots trace back nearly 140 million years, still influencing the region through leftover mantle plume activity. On another, a modern fault boundary near Venezuela and Trinidad measured and found to be locked and loaded with enough stress for a magnitude 8 earthquake. Layered on top, a statistical pattern linking Earth's rotational slowdowns to spikes in Caribbean seismicity, with a forecast pointing toward increased risk, beginning around 2030, and underlying all of it, an active subduction zone that is part of a much larger process reshaping the entire Atlantic Ocean over geological time. None of these are new discoveries invented for shock value. Each comes from serious, peer-reviewed research using real data collected over years of careful observation. What is genuinely concerning to people inside this field is seeing how many of these independent threads are converging on the same region at roughly the same time. Scientists are cautious people, quick to point out the enormous uncertainty involved in forecasting anything related to earthquakes. But even with that caution built in, the tone coming out of recent Caribbean tectonics, research has noticeably shifted toward framing findings in terms of present and future hazard. For the millions of people who live along the Caribbean plate boundary, and the millions more who visit the region every year without a second thought about the ground beneath them, this research carries real weight. Coastal cities across northern Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, and the islands strung along the Lesser Antilles sit directly on top of, or immediately adjacent to, some of the most actively studied and increasingly concerning tectonic structures on the planet. The Caribbean plate is not a quiet, settled piece of the Earth's crust sitting passively between its larger neighbors. It is an active, evolving system shaped by processes, stretching back nearly 140 million years and still very much in motion today, apparently entering another period of heightened activity in the years ahead. It helps to look at what this same system has already produced in the past, rather than only what scientists predict for the future. In 1902, Mount Pelee on the island of Martinique erupted with a speed and violence that shocked the scientific community, sending a superheated cloud of gas and volcanic material racing down the mountainside and through the city of Saint-Pierre in minutes. Nearly 30,000 people died, one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in recorded history, produced by the exact same subduction system scientists are studying today, with far more advanced tools. Further south, the Soufriere Hills volcano on Montserrat, dormant for centuries, suddenly reawakened in 1995, burying towns under ash and permanently reshaping the island. These are direct evidence of what this wind pressure inside the crust finally finds a way to the surface. The earthquake history is just as sobering. Haiti was devastated by a massive earthquake in 2010, caused by movement along fault systems marking the northern boundary of the Caribbean plate, killing well over 100,000 people and displacing more than 1 million others. It remains a reminder that a plate boundary does not need a maximum magnitude event to cause devastating loss of life, especially where infrastructure was never built with modern seismic codes in mind. That history is exactly why the new findings near Venezuela and Trinidad carry so much weight, since a boundary capable of a magnitude 8 earthquake, sitting beneath cities built decades before precise satellite monitoring existed, represents exposure that goes far beyond a theoretical concern. There is a tsunami dimension to this risk that rarely gets attention. Subduction zone earthquakes are especially effective at generating tsunamis because the sudden vertical displacement of the seafloor during a rupture can shove an enormous volume of ocean water upward all at once. And the Lesser Antilles subduction zone has exactly the geometry required to produce that kind of displacement. Volcanic flank collapses add another layer of risk. Since a sudden slope failure on one of the ark's steep island, volcanoes can displace water just as effectively as an earthquake, leaving coastal communities across the eastern Caribbean exposed to both hazards at once. Perhaps the most striking part of this story is how invisible it remains to people who actually spend time in the region. Travelers walk along beaches in Trinidad and hike volcanic trails in Montserrat with no visual sign of the forces working beneath them. There is no crack in the ground marking the locked fault, no warning light above the subduction zone quietly dragging Atlantic crust into the mantle. The entire system operates silently, measured only through satellites, buried seismometers and painstaking models built by researchers who spend years analyzing data most of us will never see. Nobody can tell you the exact day a locked fault will finally rupture, and nobody can promise the rotational slowdown forecast for the years around 2030 will translate into a specific eruption or earthquake on a specific island. What researchers can say, based on decades of careful measurement, is that the underlying conditions for increased hazard are lining up in a way that deserves serious attention. And that is exactly why so many scientists are choosing to speak up about it now, rather than waiting for the ground to make the point for them.